Hello, I'm Cynthia Marks, and I head up the Holistic Psychoanalysis Foundation, founded by my late husband, Dr. Bernard Bale. Welcome to And Now Love. Today, we are discussing the intersection of power, policy, and the human soul. Dr. Bernard Bale spent decades exploring the mother's imprint, the profound idea that a mother's unresolved suffering can occupy the mind of her child, sometimes erasing the child's true self before it even has a chance to be born. He sometimes called this a state of internal wandering, where a person lives their life but doesn't truly inhabit it. When we look at the streets of Los Angeles, we see this theory made manifest in our systems for the individuals living in Skid Row and the struggling communities of the 57th District in particular. The imprint isn't just psychological, it is systemic. It is the weight of being unseen by the law and erased by the economy. Joining us is Assemblywoman Sade Elhawary. Sade's career has been dedicated to a single radical aim: rising people up. From her roots in community organization to her work in the California State Assembly, she is an architect of social reclamation. She understands that to rise up, a person needs more than a resource. They need to be restored. Thank you so much. You're doing all of that.
Yes, and I'm so proud to be able to now do it from a different role and having the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I really do feel like there's an intersection between what you're doing and what we're trying to share with the world in our way about how important it is to really love each other, to be able to operate from who we authentically are, and to help each other rise up. I mean, as humans, we really need to keep in mind that we're a community of humans.
Yes, definitely. And I think sometimes we forget that in the work that we do, and I even think about how much work there is to do good work. And sometimes we just keep pushing and we forget to acknowledge that we're humans doing this work too. And I think that part is important. So I love that you said that.
So tell us how you got started with this district. What about the process led you to wanting to represent this district?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my career here in South Central as a community organizer, and it was a huge opportunity as a young person to be able to step into work that had been started decades before me with Mayor Karen Bass, who at the time had started an organization when she was working as a in the emergency room as a physician's assistant, and realized the impact of the crack cocaine epidemic on Black communities in particular, but South Central, which at the time was really starting to transition and becoming more Black and Latino. And she really thought about the importance of bringing communities together rather than from this punitive lens, to really think about alternatives to solving this crisis through opportunities to really center public health, center community in those solutions. And being able to work there as a youth organizer when I first started my career. I had just graduated from my master's at Harvard to become a high school history teacher. I didn't have this kind of understanding of organizing, with the exception of Barack Obama, our president, who had done that when he was younger. And when I was asked to really consider this position, I thought, I really want to focus on kids in the classroom. That's my goal. I don't want to just be, another educator that allows children to go through the school to prison pipeline, and some people fall and some people make it to college and some make it to Harvard. I wanted to think about, how do we not just have exceptions to the rule, but really invest in all children? Because my own sister, Jasmine, had, unfortunately been pushed out of school as in high school, and really took about 10 years to then figure out how to get back on her feet and back into school. And so, as a youth organizer, I love the work that I got to do. I had an opportunity to work in high schools in South Central, developing the leadership of the community, looking at how we could get the young people to be a part of the change that they wanted to see. And that really opened doors for me that I would have never thought that would help me get to where I am today. And ultimately, I think I would say, being a youth organizer was the crux of how I landed here. How do we center community in decisions that we make at the highest levels? How do we ensure that when we want to, create policy, create legislation, think about our budget and the values that it really reflects, that we really center community in that process? And so that's really how I got started in this world, and how I ultimately ended up here with amazing mentors like Mayor Bass, and now our council president here in Los Angeles, Marquise Harris Dawson, who was my first boss when I got to Cocoa.
That's a great story to your start. So that is one of the major issues that you are contending with, I believe, is better services for youth.
Right.
And what are some of the other major issues? And then I kind of want to touch on each of them.
Yeah, so I often talk about the work that I do from the lens of two core pillars that we have in our office, um, and kind of under the umbrella of community centered government, because everything we do, the intention is to be community centered. So, on the one hand, we have wellness equity, which focuses on mental health, substance abuse treatment, and access, as well as being thoughtful around our environmental justice and what it means to have wellness based on just green spaces and community and clean air and clean water. And then on the other hand, our pillar around restorative justice incorporates everything from how do we prevent people from getting in the system in the first place, to how do we intervene and really have, community intervention opportunities. How do we keep folks from being, funneled into the system? What alternatives do we have to incarceration? And if they are impacted by the system, how do we really rehabilitate folks and ensure that we're thoughtful about, parole reform and reentry, employment opportunities, and even housing?
Mm-hmm. And I think that you coming into this district with these ideas, fabulous ideas, is a lot to achieve. When you first started with this position, it was none of those things, I would imagine. And I know you're working at it slowly. There are a lot of steps in the process, but that, thinking about youth and thinking about, let's see if we can figure out how to show some respect to the process of being a youngster and respect the struggles that people are going through as individuals, give them clean air, food, safe spaces, then ultimately down the road, that is beneficial to everyone. I mean, then those people get to grow up in a healthier situation. They are less likely to be incarcerated. They're more likely to love their own children in a healthy, well, love is always healthy, let's say, real love, but they're in a position to better understand the importance of, taking care of their own children, their friends, their communities, being helpful in their communities. So is that a goal? Is sort of what happens later if we do these things now?
Yeah. So, a part of all of this is that at the state level, I have certain opportunities that I now have access to really advocate for, to push for, to champion, in terms of our state budget, in terms of our legislation at the state level. But I also have a district office. And so at the district level, it's what kind of resources do our communities need? How can we connect them to those, especially related to state departments and agencies that sometimes aren't as responsive to our communities for various reasons. And so in this case, recognizing the need for us to think about at the state level, how do we push during a deficit when we don't have enough money at the state level? How do we push to make sure that funding doesn't get taken away from where it's needed most, from our most vulnerable, that we're not allowing the budget to be balanced on the backs of our community members that often already are struggling, already don't have enough? I had, so when we think about what it takes to get to ultimately what we want to see in terms of our communities surviving, thriving, not just surviving, we know that part of that is what does the government do to ensure that communities at the center, that we invest in our communities so that we don't end up seeing these long-term outcomes that oftentimes are so negative in communities like ours, in inner cities, and urban centers, in spaces that like South Central that have been painted so negatively for so long that people don't even call it South Central anymore. They call it South LA, right? And so I think, when we think about what it takes to invest in a young person, right? So I'm a foster mom. I'm so, proud to have been able to, support a young person through their process. And the young person, who I am fortunate to be a mother to, her name's McKayla. When I met her, she was 15 years old, and she had lived a life of, a lot of struggle with her family, instability, food insecurity, housing insecurity at many parts of her life. And her family really struggled with um, addiction and alcoholism, and so much that often led to neglect that she faced. And when I met her, she wasn't doing well in school. So, as an example, how do we ensure that young people like McKayla have the love and support that they need, but also recognizing that her parents have that as well, right? And in that time period, when she was unfortunately removed from her home, she was 17 years old. It was, at this kind of point where she was already transitioning to the next part of her life. When I met her, she had these grades. She ultimately ended up, really changing her kind of um, disposition related to school, recognizing that she needed to do well in terms of her education if she was going to get out of the situation that she was in. And when she was removed from her home and I was able to step in, I also wanted to ensure that her parents had what they needed so that they could be better. And sometimes that's not what our systems do, right? They take the child and they villainize or demonize the family. They don't think about reunification. They don't give opportunities for the families, not that they never do, right? But that oftentimes that's what we see. And I think for us, we have to think about, well, what led her parents down that road? That what can we do? What did we not do enough of to invest in them to have quality education, to have access to workforce development opportunities? What are the things that they were lacking? And how do we make sure that we continue to invest in young people like McKayla to not have to be removed from their homes to have access to these amazing opportunities in their own futures, right? And so I think those are the things that I hope I get to, really think about in terms of shifting outcomes. McKayla did go to college and she struggled in college. She went to San Francisco State, came back home after a couple years. She's in community college now and ready to transfer. She has a job. She's worked a couple of jobs that she's loved with young people here, right? And all of that is because she had the investment. And we just don't invest enough in our communities. And I think my hope is that in this new position, with these new, with this focus on wellness, with this focus on justice, that we really do everything we can to ensure that our communities really are able to thrive.
Well, and it sounds like you have support in your endeavor because here you are. You were voted in, of course. So that's exciting. It's nice
Yes.
to know that there are plenty of people who agree with you. So when you're talking about Michaela's parents and addressing their struggles, is that an easy thing to bring forth? Are people listening on the other end, the people who may need to, say, pass, help you pass a bill or provide funding? Is that a tough one?
I think we're all working as hard as we can together. Um, there are some amazing groups that really see and want to prioritize family reunification. I've seen it from the organizers on the ground that are prioritizing family care over foster care. And how do we also make sure that, when maybe they're put into the foster care system with an aunt or a grandmother or, an uncle, that they also have the opportunities that they would have in the foster care system. We've seen those changes happen over time, and we continue to see the opportunities for us to shift the language that we've used so often around why children are removed from their families, and how that, oftentimes there's these cultural distinctions that push social workers to make certain decisions that maybe aren't fully understood. And so some of that is changing, even in legislation, even in the opportunities that we know are necessary for us to really make real change, right? Like legislation is created sometimes in a vacuum, or sometimes when we think about in a particular period in time, right, or point in time where those families were demonized. That oftentimes when we think about the foster care system and what happened as a result of the crack cocaine epidemic, people were saying, well, these families are addicts and we need to lock them up or we need to remove their children, rather than thinking about, well, how do we support this from a public health standpoint so that those folks really have the opportunity to fully heal from what they're going through, fully, be able to rehabilitate from that addiction so that they can ultimately have access to having their children with them and bringing their children back home. But at the time, that's not what we were thinking. We were thinking about, very punitive, very, tough on crime, no war on drugs. And we've seen the implications, we've seen the repercussions. And so now we have to really think about what does it take for us to shift that pendulum back and really do the work to shift those systems that we ultimately created ourselves.
Mhm. It's the idea of punishing parents and then removing this child and thinking that this is the best thing for the child is without regard at all to what this child is carrying forward from now being without his parents or not having to recover from whatever the situation was that existed when he
Right.
was with his parents. And I do feel like there's a much bigger opening into this outlook than there was before, and you're working on that again, so thank you so much. In terms of getting to the bottom of that, I think it's really important, by the way, which is why I keep bringing it up, that we look at the family, that we look at the parents, that we look at the people that are bringing children into the world. Where does that start when you're looking at a family and assessing a situation? We don't really assess a situation until there's some damage that's been done. And I don't know if it's because of funding that we look at it and then come back and
Yeah, I think we're moving in that direction. I'll say that the court systems are doing better. Even, one of the pieces of legislation we're looking at is for the judges that are in family court to have some type of experience in whether it's social work, whether it's their background that just fully like understands what children are going through and what families are going through. Because when you have someone who doesn't understand that, the way that they treat families, the way that they treat children is so far from what we know our families deserve, right? And as a young person myself who went through family court because my parents separated and all of what comes from those experiences, and then you think about child dependency and what happens when our children who are in foster care, and listening to McKayla's stories when she would come back from court with her attorney who was there. Thankfully, right, we have these organizations who have stepped in, who have filled in the gap, who are, organizations who really are there for the children and those who are there to understand what the families need, right? I think that there are programs, there are opportunities. We aren't all the way there yet. It takes time. We've created a system that ultimately was harmful. And to fix that system, to truly make that system work for us, we have to do a lot of work to get to the roots of what we ultimately created and why and how those shifts need to be made. The legislation that is put on my desk every day when people come to ask if we are willing to champion or, author that kind of legislation, so much of it is aligned with what we're talking about right now. But we also don't have like endless opportunities to do that. And sometimes legislation is not implemented on the ground level because it's so ingrained in our systems. And so we have to think about what's that? What is that? What does it take to do that? What are the opportunities? Who are the people that we need to bring in to ensure that when we are expecting this type of, systems change, or organizational change, that we have the right folks who are really helping to lead us through that. Because, just if you're used to doing something for so long, and you have uh, been ingrained in that culture, then you don't believe that it's anything's wrong with it, right? Until people are willing to really push in a real way.
Yes, yeah. And I think that even goes to, speaks to us as individuals. We live the life we live. That's what we know, that's what we experience. It's hard to imagine that we could do something different. It's sometimes hard to imagine that we could have a life beyond what we have. And so if someone tells you that you've done this thing and that's bad and we're taking away your child, you almost, I think a lot of us would just buy into it, that because I've lived this life of famine on so many levels, emotional, I'm frightened, I'm not fed, that becomes part of who you are, and to expect something different is often hard.
Yeah, I think, we are in a time right now, even where we see these shifts away from investing in our social safety net programs that are so important for our community members. And if we continue down that path, we're really, I think, giving up in so many ways on the opportunities that we know are necessary for folks to be able to thrive. And so I think that's exactly right.
Yes, and I think now in particular we've maybe started to make some headway in letting folks know they're safe and held, and we're pulling the rug out from under that.
Yeah, truly. And, you know, just acknowledging where we are in this time in our society, right? Like that we're investing in this, um, like militarized force against our community members who, when we think about where our tax money is going at the federal level, it's really going to hurt our communities, to harm them rather than to help them. Uh, the impact on things like Medicare that people are so reliant on, the impact to SNAP benefits, and you know the opportunities for our communities who we know, these families who need so much, and it really does show our values when we're willing to invest our budget in what we're seeing now, with innocent folks who are being killed, who are fighting for our community members, fighting to ensure that we have um, at least the very basics of treatment for our communities who are here as immigrants, who we rely on so much. And so I think about like the what is this administration telling us at the federal level, and what are we doing on the state level to combat that? Because we're not perfect. We have a structural deficit. It's going to be difficult. Unless we're willing to fight to bring in new revenue, we are going to end up, really kind of replicating what this administration is doing across the country. And so I think all of those things are tough. They're not easy at all. And we have to think about the real human impact on the ground. What does that mean for the single mother who attends USC, who is getting her master's, who won't even have access to childcare because those funds are being frozen because we're a democratic state? Like these things that are so backwards, so ridiculous that we even have to fight for something as just common knowledge that we know everyone needs access to, that parents can't work, they can't go to school if they don't have access to something like childcare, and yet we're willing to remove that. And I just heard from a young woman whose name is Marilinda, and she shared her story. She shared what it would mean to not have childcare services for her 2-year-old daughter Serenity, who literally, she's going to school to become a social worker, to give back to her community. She has grants that it require her to come back to the community and give back, that she can't pay back if she doesn't finish school. But that's who we're taking away from. That's the real human impact, right? The folks who won't have access to health insurance because we've taken it away from our undocumented community, our farm workers who are working every day, who then won't have access to basic health needs when they're literally like breaking their backs on the farms to feed us, right? Like, this is what we're doing. And I think we really have to shift our understanding of what it means to invest in our communities and to even participate in, like, this, like, the world of like the civic engagement that is necessary for our communities to understand this is the real human toll when we, kind of decide how we will or won't participate in our system, in our system of voting, in our systems every day of having the opportunity to ensure our communities really have their voices heard, right? This is the democratic process we know we need so that we don't end up in these situations.
And your position, you've been an assemblywoman for a little over a year,
Yes, just a little over a year.
and you have seen some amazing changes that I think must mean that you're constantly having to change the way you operate.
We are at the state level on the front lines fighting back against what's happening. And I think doing everything that we can on that level. We have incredible folks who are leading, my colleagues who I get to work with every day, who are working directly with folks on the ground. This is not an effort that just happens right from the top down. It has to be grassroots too. We see that in Minneapolis, how grassroots, efforts have really pushed to see real changes finally happen with this administration and the decisions that they're making. And so now at the state level, one of the things that I realized is, beyond legislation that fights back against ICE, that fights back against the border enforcement that we see happening, that is honestly like just out of control at this point. Beyond that, we also are thinking about, I mentioned a little bit earlier, how do we bring money back home when it's being taken away from us at the federal level, right? I just got an email today about the food banks who need $15 million dollars so that they can continue to operate. The food banks don't even have enough money because of how much they have been, literally the rug has been pulled out from under them. And so in this moment, we have to do everything we can. I mentioned earlier that I'm an organizer, and when I first started in the state assembly, I had so much imposter syndrome. I did not know if I was in the right place. Like, I was like, are you sure that, I'm proud to be elected, but am I the right person? I've never been in office before. It's my first time ever having been elected. And I did it with an incredibly, amazing coalition of volunteers and community members and labor organizations. And I knew I had to come to fight, right? But I didn't know what it would take to do that. And so at first I thought, well, maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe I don't know what it's really going to be like. I've only been an organizer. What I realized is that I'm an organizer and I had to lean into that. But initially I didn't realize that that was my strength, like I thought that it was, it meant that I didn't have enough experience. I have a lot of colleagues who have been mayors of their cities and towns, that they have been council members or they worked for an elected official. And I had never done any of that. And so what I've been able to do is really ensure that, we work together, because so much of this work can feel siloed. So much of what it means to be an elected official is that you're thinking about how you continue to grow in this kind of world of politics. What's the next thing you're going to run for? People will always ask that. And for me, it's about how do we focus on what we're doing right now? And so bringing together assembly members and senators who don't often talk, having conversations about the budget and about revenue that we don't often have, talking about why we can't just cut ourselves out of a problem that is ultimately going to hurt our most vulnerable populations, that we have to think about how do we bring money home? How do we generate revenue in a state that is the fourth largest economy in the world, that generates all this money from AI? We're so proud of who we are as a state, and yet we don't have enough money to make sure that our community members aren't living on the streets, to make sure that our community members aren't struggling just to pay their rent every month, to feed their families every month, to pay for things like their cars and insurance and their all the things that come with just their utilities, right? All of that, it makes a difference. And so we have to talk about it. We have to really think about, how do we push against corporate greed? How do we bring and hold, our billionaires and our incredibly wealthy people to account? Because that's what's going to take. That's what it's really going to take if we want to see things really change. And I think that's the moment that we're in, is that, the human toll of all of the things that we're seeing, if we're not willing to work together to have those conversations, if we're just siloed, if we're just worried about our own egos and growing into the next political platform that we'll have, we won't focus on the here and now, which is that our community members need us now. They
Right,
need
which
us
is why you
right
are all
now.
hired to do what you do.
Exactly. Exactly. And to be elected means that we have to really represent our communities in the best way possible. And for me, those stakes are even higher. I represent Skid Row, I represent South Central LA, I represent communities that are the highest and lowest on most of the worst scales that we could imagine. And it's means that I have to make sure that at every point, I'm not just saying that the status quo is where we need to stay. It means that we have to push on every system. We have to ask every question. We have to say that we're not willing to just allow things to just be because that's how it was. We have to change it and be willing to change it together.
It feels like there is this terrible mindset, and I think it affects your district more than some others, in that it's so hard to lift people up from that place, let's say Skid Row, that they're the first to be forgotten. Why would you invest any more money there? Because it's an impossible task. And but it's the opposite. It's as if we have to invest money there, and we have to figure out a way to change our approach. The status quo is just absolutely not working, not at all. And what do your constituents tell you about their neighborhoods, about how they're living life right now?
Yeah, I would say, you know, we were really a part of the way that I do this work is that I don't do it without making sure that we center the voices of those who are impacted, because I'm not an expert on everything. I don't know if I'm an expert on anything, I'm really proud of the work that I've done in my past and as an organizer, as an educator, but I know that I can't do this work alone. I know that it's going to take really listening to the voices of the folks on the ground. And so one of our bills was really focused on the intersection between mental health and homelessness. And what do we do to ensure that we have more opportunities for mental health supports on the ground in a place like Skid Row, knowing that folks don't have the same access to a therapist, don't have the same access to their insurance, don't even have access sometimes to a cell phone. There's these great opportunities like USC Street Medicine that focus oftentimes on physical health, but what do we do to incentivize more supports around mental health? That was the conversation that we were having. And in order to have that, I didn't try to find the answer on my own because I know that that's not ever going to yield the best type of response and the best type of solution. That ultimately, if we want to do that, we have to go to the source. And so we worked with a lot of the stakeholders on the ground, the service providers who work in Skid Row, who work every day with our community members who live on Skid Row. And we said, how can we really prioritize the solutions that you all already see happening? Maybe there's innovative solutions that we see that are maybe just happening on a small scale. How can we scale that? How can we replicate that? How can we ensure that you have enough funding for that? I got an opportunity to go to see the Skid Row Care Center. It's this beautiful space that was created because they have a Skid Row action plan, a group of stakeholders that meet every single month to talk about what it takes, including residents themselves. It has respite beds. It has, opportunities for folks to have lockers and showers and things that I think sometimes are kind of spread out in the community, but it was a centralized location. That was so powerful and so beautiful to be able to see and then to hear the stories of what it took to bring that together, to make that happen. That's what we're doing this work for, right? That's what this is all about. And so, yes, people are always going to say, don't throw more money at the problem. But I think, how do we work together with the folks on the ground to find the right solutions, to to our constituents who want to see homelessness end, don't want to see Skid Row continue to skyrocket, to balloon, right? But to really say, what does it take to do this? And, some people want to criminalize our communities. They want to just lock people up. They want to get rid of folks. They want to send them back to wherever they're from. Or if they, were sent here on a bus from another city or state, right? That there's just this opportunity or idea that folks just want them to, they're addicts. They just need to be locked up. They're struggling with mental health. They just need to be locked up. And that's just not the answer. It's not going to make things better for us. We know that it doesn't help our communities to continue this cycle of trauma, like you talked about. This is real trauma that our communities face. Most of the folks who live on Skid Row come from my district. Most of the folks in Skid Row are also Black. Most of them were impacted by the crack cocaine crisis. And what did we do then that made things the way they are now? And how do we try to solve for that, knowing that it won't happen overnight, and recognizing that our constituents who want to see a lot of these changes, a lot of these, they want to see this happen and get fixed overnight. It's not going to be solved that quickly, but we do have to do the work as quickly as possible to push on the system that has created what we see today. And so, yes, we know that there have been funding issues. We know that there have been issues around, how we've done this work, but it requires us to be collaborative. It requires us to trust one another. It requires all of us to lean in. I have the opportunity I've had the opportunity to meet who you had an opportunity to interview, Adonai, who's such an incredible human, right? And through the Homecoming Project, Adonai actually lives in our home that I share with my daughter and her partner. Because as we think about what happens with people who are coming home from the justice system, they're often relegated to not having access to anywhere to live, not having access to any supports and jobs and work and just training, workforce training. So if we aren't doing that, folks end up on the streets. We know there's a pipeline from the prisons into homelessness. And so being able to do and think about like the Homecoming Project as an example of something we could also do from the perspective of our folks who are on Skid Row. What are we doing? How do we look within to talk about how we can support our community members who are struggling as well, right? And Oregon, I think, is doing that, where they pay for, they support with paying the rent for a room that someone is offering to someone who's living on the streets, right? And so I think it requires all of us to be willing to invest, to not have this idea that we can't trust our neighbors, that we can't, invest in and love and care and embrace our neighbors, that they've been through trauma and that trauma, it doesn't define them, that they can actually be healed if we give them the right supports around healing, and that they can actually honestly thrive if we truly are willing to lean in as a community. And oftentimes what happens is we actually we retreat. We say that this is just how it is. They just want to be like that. That's their fault. Rather than thinking about, well, what as a society did we do to create that? And I think that's what I hope in the experience and the opportunity I have in the state assembly to really help push us on, to really not end up just in this situation that we criminalize and that we're punitive, but that we're really looking at other alternatives that are looking at different types of solutions around public health, around healing, and around really like restorative justice opportunities, and not just what we often see in terms of punishment.
Yes, and there's a microscope on your community because there's so much desperation there, and it's interesting in that I think a lot of times we try to save ourselves by saying it's us and them, and there's no helping them. So then we don't need to invest any part of ourself in that process, and we just continue to ignore it, put little money toward it, put little thought toward it. But really, we are nothing but one giant community, and
Right.
Those of us who can support, and we can really not just have you uplifting, but all of us can do something. How do people get involved in your community to help that process, to help those that are struggling know that they're respected. And I love that you said we are not our trauma. Thank you. I love you for that.
Of course, I think there are so many ways to get involved. There are so many ways, and I think it's an opportunity for us to think about, well, what capacity do we have to help, right? Someone, as I mentioned earlier, someone might have an extra room in their home, but they work so many hours and they travel all around the world, and they have a crazy job, but they have this extra room that they can offer. They have an ADU, right? There's something like that, and there's people that maybe they have an extra hour to be able to help make calls to folks who are struggling with their evictions, and thinking about how different folks might have community organizations might have opportunities to join a rally or a protest, right? There are so many ways for us to make a difference right now, whether it's talking to our family members when we think about the division that's happening in our community right now, and across the nation. There's this idea that, well, if you voted for him, then I don't want to talk to you. No, we need to talk to each other. We have to have conversations with each other. We have to
Absolutely.
be willing to have the hard, difficult conversations that acknowledge that we make decisions that come from a place often of maybe a lack of understanding, or maybe an understanding that we thought we had and we recognize might not be correct anymore, or that we acknowledge that people make decisions from their pain. They've been struggling. They thought that this was the president that would help them with the economy. They didn't realize that he would do this to our community members. There are so many ways for us to have conversations, even that don't just write people off, that don't just push people away. And I think we don't realize that even something as small as a conversation goes a long way. That in this time, if we can unite, we are so much stronger together. And I think that's what we really need to be focused on too.
Yes, I think really, deeply listening to each other and considering each other is going to bring us to our best decisions.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I honestly feel like in this time, things are difficult, and people have different, desires to get involved, or abilities or capacities. But I think being able to do something matters,
Yes, and
whatever that is.
what even have making sure your voice is heard. I think a lot of us feel that we're just too small. We're just a little tiny piece of the big giant haystack, and what could we possibly do? We need everybody to speak up and help out, and it's precious when you really can share from your heart what you know to be the truth.
Absolutely. I want to share one story. I know we have to close out soon, but I just want to mention that I um, I made a decision to run for office because I was really encouraged to do it. I had heard about, or read about the leaked recordings at LA City Council between our council members, Latino council members who were incredibly racist and prejudiced in their conversations that they were having on, at a meeting that they didn't know was being recorded. But it really resonated with me in terms of how horrible it is that we have elected officials that represent us, that talk like this, that think like this, that ultimately make decisions from this place, right?
Yes,
And
and that
I
is really ingrained in who they are.
yes, and I thought, what can we do about this? How can we fight back? And there was this protest that was going to happen at City Hall to demand everyone to resign. And one of the things that I heard, one of the council members say was, "F him, he's with the blacks." And she's talking about a Latino district attorney, George Gascon at the time, who had been doing really great work that was ultimately resonating with all our communities. And we know the justice system has impacted Black folks in such a profound way that he was supporting Black people in addition to Latinos, in addition to everyone else, right? And she, instead of, uplifting the fact that he was in solidarity or supporting other communities, she was denigrating him for that. And I remember thinking that I wanted to do something and I didn't know what that was. I didn't know how I could raise my voice. At the time, I was working on a campaign with Mayor Karen Bass, and I knew that her focus was on making sure we defeated her opponent, her billionaire opponent. Um, and I was involved with an organization called the Black LA Young Democrats, and I was so proud to be able to have this idea. And then my team was like, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it." And I said, "Let's make T-shirts, and they should say I'm with the Blacks, so everyone knows that we're all supporting one another. That everyone's with the Blacks. That nothing's wrong with saying that someone's with the Blacks. That solidarity over everything, right? Like." And so I had this idea and they were like, "Yeah, go ahead. That's a great idea. Run with it." And I'm like, "Well, like help me." And they're like, "Well, let's." So I created a design. I said, "What do you think of this design?" They're like, "Perfect design." I'm like, "Give me feedback. Let me know how I can make it better." They're like, "It's good. Don't overthink it. Just move. Just make it happen." And I called a cousin of mine who helped make t-shirts at the time. And I said, "Can you make these for us? Please. I need them by tomorrow." He's like, "Okay, we'll meet at 5 a.m. and then you can go to your meeting." And so I met him. He finished up the t-shirts. I was back on the freeway by like 7 or 8 a.m. I made it to the city hall meeting just in time, the city council meeting. And I had all these t-shirts with me and I passed them out to the people that were with us, but we had enough to give a few others. And people were so excited, like, "Whoa, like this is amazing. We love this. This is great." And someone said, "Well, you need to go speak. Go up there, talk about it, talk about the solidarity, talk about the t-shirts." And I was like, "Absolutely not. I came up for the t-shirts. That was my contribution, right?"
Yeah.
I felt good giving that. I like being behind the scenes. I've always been behind the scenes. But because I made that decision, because people saw my leadership, because they heard my voice, because they saw that we were all in solidarity, I had an opportunity to speak that day. And that's what led me here. It was speaking, it was being passionate, it was having this opportunity for folks to see me and to be spotlighted so people could say, "Hey, you need to be at this table. We need you in this room. We know that your voice is missing from these spaces." And ultimately, because of that, folks said, "You would be a perfect person to run for our community who understands those dynamics, who understands why we need to have representation of Black and Brown communities and not just one over the other." And I thought that was I think, such an important story for folks to know that you can be engaged in any way, whatever works for you. If you're creative, lean into that. If you love social media, lean into that. If you're a mental health person, let's help our communities heal, right? That is what you can do. Like, if it's what you have the opportunity to do, if it's a skill, a talent you have, bring that to us, and bring that with you so that you can help us really make change in this moment.
There are so many places to let that happen, and your story is awesome. And that applies to all of us when we really come to something with compassion and from our heart. You can see how many people sort of catch on and they're with you, and look how that propelled, and now you're so outspoken and doing this awesome thing for your community. And I know we have to go, and I wish I could talk with you longer, but really, thank you for coming from this place of love. I'm struck by the core overlap between Dr. Bale's theory and the work being done by you in the 57th District and those that you call upon to support you. You are essentially legislating a new imprint, one of dignity, visibility, and agency. Whether it's through expanding faster youth programs or building a system of healing over incarceration, we are seeing what it looks like when a society decides to make room for its most vulnerable to finally exist. Thank you for proving that while the trauma we carry may be written into our history, it does not have to own our futures. Thank you, thank you. Keep on doing this fabulous work.
Thank you so much. It was so good to meet you. So good to be here with you today. And I'm looking forward to many more conversations.
Thank you. And if somebody wants to reach out or support you, how do they do that?
They can follow me on Instagram. I have an Instagram that's a personal Instagram, but it includes all of the work that we're doing on the legislative side too, at Sade Elhawary, SadeElhawary. And I respond to all my messages. I don't post everything on my own. I have a team who helps with that, but I respond to make sure that we're really connected to the community.
Thank you. Thank you. And we look forward to knowing more about your political path because it's clear you're in it for all the right reasons.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you.